Good morning, Right On Sports family, supporters, and others watching. I'm Sean Harrington. I am a West Orange High School sophomore. I'm a Right On Sports alum, and I am a two-sport high school athlete. Ever since I can remember, I was in sports, whether it was in fall soccer, what we call little kickers, winter wrestling or basketball, or spring baseball. I was rarely not on a field, pitch, court, or mat. Those experiences fostered my falling in love with athletics, competition, and play. As I got older, those sports whittled down to two: baseball and wrestling. And as time went on, the sports became more intense, time-consuming, and hyper-competitive. Even in middle school, I was expected to be by my coaches to not only attend the everyday practices, but to also play for a club, one that would require shelling out usually thousands of dollars just to play. As high school came around, that fact became even more true. In a pandemic world where which we live, we are witnessing depressive statistics in youth sports, and we can only ask why. Rod Gilbert, professor of physical education at Montclair State, and John McCarthy, journalist and youth sports coach, are going to help us answer some of the major questions revolving around the state of youth sports. Rod, John, thank you so much for coming, and let's begin. I wanted to focus on four real main sets over what is causing this decline in youth sports, and those are being the development of youth sports from fun-focused to college-focused, analyzing really the impact of COVID-19 as a whole, developing reasons why the normal athlete, the average athlete, can't play inexpensive, stress-free sports, and brainstorming why really other activities are really seeping into sports and how they're kind of not allowing kids to do both and really having to choose maybe the arts or sports. You can't do both. So as we get into things, let's start with just recognizing what the pandemic has done for sports. Let's start with Rod here. When we saw youth sports before the pandemic, were they at a stable point, or would you say that they were already going down?
Well, I am really not involved with working with athletes at that level, but John is every day, so he'd be better to answer that question.
Definitely. So John, as a coach, from your perspective, what was the state of youth sports, maybe 2019, let's say?
Well, first off, I see the Mets logo guy behind you, so I imagine that's the team you root for. So it's a little hard for me to answer any of your questions. But in addition to that, just so you know, I taught at West Orange High School for 34 years. And what sports do you play?
Baseball and wrestling.
So you're with Coach Zakella all of the time?
I am with Zakella all the time, yep.
Well, he and I are best buds. To answer your question, before the pandemic, we saw a number of sports losing participants. We got away from the CTE in terms of the concussions with football and wrestling, and believe it or not, cheerleading and soccer. So we were starting to see a decline in participation in those particular sports. In addition to that, I think over time, we've seen people lose interest in football, particularly, not just because of the concussions, but they've expanded their season. They start lifting in June, and if they're fortunate enough to play in the playoffs, they're playing in December. So I'm sorry, in late November. So the season has gotten so long that you really can't do a lot of other things. In addition to that, the NJSIAA under Colleen McGuire has changed the schedules of all of sports because they want to have kids be able to play multiple sports. And there was always a season overlap. People who were on your wrestling team, if the football team was still involved in the state tournament, they couldn't start. So that's one of the things that they're trying to do. And so that ends up having people drop out of it. I have a number of theories about why they're not playing baseball as well, but I'll let you get to other questions.
No, yeah. So if we were to look at really a contrast here, you're saying that football, cheerleading, wrestling, they're probably doing the worst in terms of drop off. Would you have a contrast before the pandemic, which sports were doing the best? Maybe what sports were maybe even growing or just at least staying stable?
I would say soccer will always stay stable, especially in New Jersey, because the dynamics, the population shifts are here. Lacrosse is probably the fastest growing sport in New Jersey, maybe even in the country. And I think cheerleading is still vibrant. I think baseball has lost its allure because the game is very slow, and this generation is used to quick images and quick responses. I noticed the number of people on baseball teams. I see teams with like 12 guys or 13 players. And I think part of that is because the failure rate is so high in that particular sport. And also, there are a lot of socioeconomic factors involved in why certain athletes don't play baseball.
Well, you bring up a good point about the player sizes. My freshman baseball team only had 10 players, so that definitely is an accurate point. But Rob, you mentioned that you didn't really work with youth sports. What could you mention what sports you did work with and what your kind of role in that is?
Well, I'm a professor, and my specialization is at Montclair State is sports psychology. So I do, like yesterday, I worked with the IHA volleyball team. They're going for the state championship today. So I work with not on an ongoing basis, but on a piecemeal basis. So I work with a lot of teams, but I'm really not aware of on a day-to-day basis about what happened with COVID. But I am aware of how much people actually miss their sports. I mean, sports was is a major component of in middle school, high school, even in college. So when sports was taken away, that was a tragedy.
Well, from your perspective, when sports shut down because of the pandemic, when you were talking to other athletes or talking to students, what was the kind of reaction, the general consensus?
Well, just like with any change, people just don't like the change. And then the seniors, it was like they stole my senior year. They stole my season. They stole the prom. They stole everything, And, it was for people who go into their senior year with all these expectations, it really was a tragedy. But I think the great athletes were training anyway. I know the wrestlers were training anyway. The club teams were training anyway,
Yeah, this is an interesting statistic here. According to USA Today, 28% of athletes post-pandemic said they were no longer interested in sports. And only 47% of athletes could say that they returned to their pre-pandemic form in terms of sports. So I could ask both of you guys to try to chime in here. How can we get athletes back into sports and get athletes back interested in sports to begin with, not just in terms of competitiveness, but just to get them back on the field?
Well, I think it's a cycle, Sean, and I think we're going to have to go through this particular cycle. Some people gave up the sports because, as Dr. Gilbert said, it wasn't a continuum. They had done it in the past fall, and then they didn't do it. So it was a lot easier to give it up because it was kind of habitual. One of the things that disturbs me is what I see in a lot of the public schools, and I think it's probably built around the success that a program has had. For instance, I work with the Montclair High School football team, and there were 4 teams we played this year. Columbia had 32 guys on the roster. Each side had 28. Bloomfield, a large school, had 32. So the enrollment on their teams was really small. But you take a school like yours at West Orange, where football has become even more competitive, you have a very large squad. So I think the attraction for kids is either A, they're an elite athlete and they're looking for a scholarship, or B, there's a winning tradition or the program is building. And what I worry about is the schools that I mentioned, where are they going to go? I mean, Harrison almost dropped football because they had like maybe 18 players. So that's my biggest concern. The non-public schools will continue to thrive because they get a lot of exposure and they send a lot of kids off to play Division I. I'm more concerned about the public schools who don't necessarily have a winning tradition. Why do I want to be involved in that? The numbers are down. So I think there's a cycle, and I think the sports will come back. But right now, there's a lot of reasons why they're not involved, and the numbers are going down.
So what kind of future implications are you expecting in terms of, especially football, like 10 years from now? What do you think it's going to be?
I think fewer schools will be playing football. I think soccer will be maintained. I just think between the combination of the concussions and the length of the season, as I said, from June all the way through November, I think that's going to see a continuation. But I think basketball will always thrive. The same with wrestling. I don't see any issues there. Lacrosse is going to continue to thrive. I worry about baseball. But I think most of the sports will survive and come back, but there's a few of them that we're seeing a decline. There are a number of schools, by the way, as you probably know, that are in combination with another school, especially the Group 1 schools. Emerson and Park Ridge are together in wrestling. There are a number of schools that have combined teams. They do that in hockey. So I think that's probably one of the ways that schools will go once enrollment starts to decline, especially among the smaller schools, Group 1 and Group 2. Group 4 and 5 are pretty solid.
Yeah, and then I just wanted to, kind of finish up this discussion in terms of COVID-19 and just kind of, really ask both of you guys here. Is the pandemic really like the beginning of the end of youth sports? Was that kind of like a chopping block, a guillotine to some of our biggest sports? Like if you look 30 years ago, 40 years ago, baseball and football were the most popular sports, arguably among high schools. And now, like John's saying here, both of them are quickly dying sports in high school. So is COVID-19 really like the beginning of the end for these sports? And was it kind of a guillotine, or was it really irrelevant? And is it just going to kind of, work back and feed into it, just a blip on the radar?
Well, I don't think nothing is going to kill sports. The biggest televised event every year is the Super Bowl. People are we're addicted to sports. And so I don't think we have to worry about that. But as John said, with football, I don't think the problem with football is COVID. The problem with football are the brain injuries, CTE and all the rest. And a lot of kids want to play football, but their parents won't let them play football. Now, that's not happening in baseball. That's not happening in soccer, but that is happening in football. And so that is a big problem. And I think what's going to happen with football is there's going to be a traumatic injury right on the field during an NFL game, maybe even a death. And that's going to, bring everything to a crisis point. Because I was at a seminar the other day with a neurophysiologist, one of the top neurophysiologists in the country, and he said there is no way that my son will ever play football. I mean, he said, with the research, there is no way I could allow him, for his own safety, play football. So for football, I don't think the problem is COVID. For everything else, I think sports is like lacrosse is going to thrive. I think everything is going to thrive.
I agree with Dr. Gilbert on that, Sean, but the one point I would add is that COVID has had an impact. Nutley High School, Union High School were not able to participate in the state tournament because they had a number of athletes who had COVID. And so you go right to a state championship game and you're not even really allowed to play. As far as the NFL is concerned, I think they're playing around with these numbers. They say the guy tests positive, the next day he was negative and so on. I'm not sure that I necessarily believe that. I don't think professional football will go anywhere because, as Dr. Gilbert and I talk when we teach together, gambling is too big of a deal with professional football. So that's really not going anywhere. But let's face it, COVID has had an impact on everything in our lives. So why not sports? But I think once this gets resolved, I think things will come back. But as Dr. Gilbert says, still have the concussion factor with football. They're working on all kinds of new helmets. They don't understand. It has nothing to do with the helmet. You can soften the impact, but it's the movement of the head that causes the concussion. So we're going after the wrong issue.
We're talking about how sports are changing, how football is changing. So I think we have to talk about, really, if we bring it to more general sense, how much youth sports have changed in terms of competitiveness, because that's an important factor in how sports have changed. So let me just ask you guys, compared to when you guys were growing up, have
Well,
you
let me
noticed
ask
any
you a question. Sean, let me
Yes.
ask you a question. What's the biggest sport in the country?
In terms of high school sports, I'd still probably say football.
No, in terms of generally.
In terms of generally, I'd
Yeah.
also say football.
Okay. Well, John said the answer. Gambling. Gambling is the biggest sport in the country. You know, it's kind of a trick question, but I mean, people get so jacked up. I mean, now if you listen to WFEN and ESPN radio, they have gambling shows. I mean, they
Yeah.
have shows on air about gambling, and that's a whole other topic. But that is the big thing now, is gambling. So do you like the sport because you gamble, or do you gamble because you like the sport?
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
sorry, I took you away.
No, totally. That's what one of the questions on election day was. About should gambling be allowed, and I think
Yeah.
was it college sports in general, or was it college sports championships? I know that was one of the questions I asked, and it got shot down. So we'll see how that continues to develop, because it just got legalized only a couple of years ago. But yeah, so we'll just pivot a little bit, and I just wanted to talk about how sports really have developed from more for fun and to be more focused on getting that scholarship, or even like getting drafted for a sport in some kids' eyes. So let me ask you guys, when you guys were growing up, how were sports different than how they were today, and how when you guys are playing, how much more intense or maybe competitive it is compared to right now?
Well, John really kind of answered this question because he was such an elite athlete. He was in another stratosphere, I was the average athlete, and sports is much more organized. I mean, people our age, what do we always say? Oh, I was going by the park today, and not one kid was playing tennis, not one kid was playing football, nobody was throwing around a baseball. Nowadays, it doesn't seem like you could have any event without a coach. It doesn't seem like do you even know what a pickup game is, John?
Outside of basketball, I do not. No.
Yeah, so a pickup game, people used to just show up at a park in the summer, 10 in the morning, and they choose sides, and they play baseball without an umpire, without an adult. And it was a whole lot of fun. Nowadays, I think everything is geared. I mean, I think their parents, with one eye, they're looking at the event, and the other eye, they're looking at the college scholarship. And John could give you statistic after statistic. In most sports, nobody gets a full scholarship. John, in baseball, does anybody get a full scholarship?
Probably well, first of all, even Division I schools, they might have 35 guys on a team, but there's only 11 scholarships. And people don't realize that, because football and basketball, they have a full complement of scholarships. They don't in soccer. And that's only in Division I. Division II has partials, and Division III, none at all. So one of the things that has changed, and I think somebody is trying to find out, who's watching, how do you get kids interested or start them along a sports path? Dr. Gilbert hit the word organized right on the head. We used to play Duke-up games, Sean. When we played basketball in the courts, you called your own foul. If you said you were fouled, you were fouled. I mean, you didn't have a referee. Now everything is organized. There was no such thing as T-ball. We played wiffle ball in somebody's driveway. The whole concept of just playing for fun. I remember when I was in the playground, and kids don't go to playgrounds anymore. We'd have teams and we would go on our own without adult supervision and play another playground. So I think sports became more formalized. I think parents were concerned about getting their kids involved in sports early on. I also think, well, it's not true. Probably a couple of decades ago, parents felt that if kids got involved in sports, they wouldn't be involved in drugs. Now, you're not familiar with that, but Dr. Gilbert and I, we went through that particular phase. But I think to answer the question that one of your listeners is looking, these days you can get involved in anything. There's so many youth sport programs. You have to be careful when you select them, because you want to know, what's the background on the people who are coaching them? Are they there really to let the kids learn to play the game and have fun playing the game? Or are they there to build their own resume and try and get kids who are going to go on and play at the next level? Dr. Gilbert mentioned statistics. Sean, you may not realize this, but 75% of all athletes drop out of organized sports by age 14. 75%. Now, if you think about the kids who played with you on younger teams, whether it was soccer or younger wrestling, and then look at the people who are still there, you'll see that that's what happens. So my suggestion to a parent looking is have kids play every sport that they possibly can, and then find one that they like and settle on that. We have way too much specialization at an early age. And that's one of the things that's killing sports as well.
And Professor McCarthy's statistic of 75%, that was well before COVID. And then when we look at, well, why are the kids dropping out? And two answers keep popping up. Parents and coaches. And the parents, there was one specific thing, it was called PGA. It was called the post-game analysis. So this might have happened with you in baseball, Sean, that, you know, after your little game, you're driving and you want to go to Dairy Queen, you want to go to Carvel, you want to get something to eat, and your parents are picking apart the game. You should have thrown to second. You should have gone for the double play. I mean, and your parents know nothing about baseball, or they know nothing about wrestling. So it's a post-game analysis that really, really hurts. And I would say a secret to the question we were talking about is how to get kids involved in a sport. Well, once a kid decides what sport they want to get involved with, find a coach who will make the kids feel good about themselves. That is much more important that they know every little intricacy about the game, but they have the personality that they want to make the kid feel good about themselves and not just win, you know? So that's, I had a friend, and she was a remarkable youth softball coach. And the remarkable thing is she knew nothing about softball, and her teams rarely ever won a game. But every year, all of the kids continued playing softball. You know, they wanted to be, because of her, they wanted to be on her team, they wanted to be around her, and they wanted to continue playing softball.
And do we think this level of organization in sports and all the specialization isn't an objectively bad thing? Because obviously there's reasons why it came up. So do we think it's actually a bad thing, or does it have its, you know, its pros along with its cons?
Well, one of the things that it's done, Sean, is it's taken away the recreation department and working with kids in the summer that way. Now everybody goes on to a traveling team. You might have a little league team, and if they're not as, let's say, talented, the better players will go on to a traveling team, and they play an inordinate amount of games. Another factor that we really haven't mentioned that changed the sports dynamic is finance. Nothing has increased as exponentially as college costs. So if you have some youth coaches, or you have some AAU coaches who are making money, let's face it, they're cash cows. And they're saying, listen, I can get your kid exposed, I can get your kid seen, et cetera, et cetera. So parents plunk down a lot of money for traveling teams. And those elite kids, they're not even involved with kids from their neighborhood anymore. And just to give you an example, they have no idea about scholarships. 1 million people play football a year, 1 million. Of that 1 million, 6% play college football. And of that 6%, that's Division 1, 2, and 3. And of those sports, less than 1% play professionally. But a lot of parents think their kid's going to be the one, or they're going to get money. They don't know that some of them are partial scholarships. A kid that I coached one time went to Seton Hall University, and he was excited because they were giving him a scholarship. He still had to pay $25,000 above that. So I think parents get kids involved in sports, and they like the fact that they're organized. I think they like the fact that they have a place to send their kid, rather than the kids trying to make up their own games. So I think that that cow's already out of the barn, Sean. We're not going to go backwards. I think you raise a good point. There are some very good things about some of these youth sports and getting kids exposed to them. The key, as Dr. Gilbert pointed out, is coaching them.
Are you still on the wrestling team, Sean?
I am. We just had our interest meeting on Wednesday.
So I was a wrestling coach back in the 70s in Massachusetts. And back in the 70s in Massachusetts, the season started the day after Thanksgiving and it ended, in the middle of February. Now, and I don't know if you're part of the wrestling culture, you wrestle year round. It's not enough to be on the team, you have to be on a club. I mean, every weekend there's a tournament someplace in the country. I mean, these tournaments have 20 mats. I've never seen 20 mats in one gym before. You go to places like Fargo and things like that. So just as a little aside, Professor McCarthy and myself, we cannot end this without giving people assignments since we're professors. So I was thinking, what is the greatest youth sports video I've ever seen in my life? It's on Netflix and it's called The Speed Cubers. And it's only 20 or 30 minutes long. And it's like what you were just talking about, Sean. Even in Rubik's Cube, they have world championships in Rubik's Cube.
Yeah.
But this is a very touching video and it gets at the heart of what sports and youth sports is all about. So it's called The Speed Cubers and it gets 5 stars. It's absolutely tremendous. Speed Cubers on Netflix.
Well, I think, like John said, that we're never going back. We're never going back to a world where, sports will be less organized than they are. So, what is the state of the average athlete? What's next for the average athlete? What are they going to do from now on?
Well, hopefully they won't be distracted and get into things like esports, which I don't even consider a sport. And we have arguments about that in college all of the time. But there's so many different things that kids can do, Sean, that they do by themselves, that they isolate themselves on. The average athlete is going to get passed by, I'm afraid, because all the attention is going to go to the elite athlete. We are in a winning culture. There's no way around that. So I'm concerned about the direction that we're going in. People don't raise their hand and chant, "We're number 5, we're number 5." So participation's not the biggest thing anymore. Winning has replaced participation. The season was great. I had fun with my friends. No, we didn't make the tournament. So that's what it's really all about. I mean, there's a big fight now over the tournament of champions. In 2 years, it won't exist. And part of it is because it was only something for the elites. There were certain schools that will never be, like a Verona or a Cedar Grove. They're not going to be in a state championship wrestling tournament. They're not going to be in a state championship football, meaning all groups, not individually. They can still be a champion in their group, but they're moving toward single champions. In the past, for instance, West Orange is playing East Orange today. So they would be playing for a sectional title. Not anymore. Now they have to play another game. They have to play Passaic County Tech. And that becomes the North Jersey tournament. And like a lot of other states, they're moving to where they want the North to play the South and get a single championship. So that's part of what's driving the sport these days. So when we talk about average athlete, the only thing that saves an average athlete is an excellent coach, because kids want to play for that coach and they'll enjoy that experience. So they'll keep coming back, like you keep coming back, because wrestling for Stefan, what he puts into it, how much he cares about you and so on. So you'll keep coming back. Elite athletes, they don't even use the high school coach anymore. In terms of recruiting, they go right to the AAU coach. They go right to the specialist. Every kid who's elite in tennis has their own private coach. It in wrestling. kids finish a wrestling practice, which has to be grueling, and then they go and spend 2 hours at the edge to get even more. So I think that the elite athletes are going to distance themselves even more. And if there is such a thing as an average athlete, they're going to be dependent upon good coaches.
Well, then let me ask you right now. Let's brainstorm right here. Are there any solutions for the average athlete? What can we do? Can we, pressure to create legislation to put more funding into recreational sports, in-house sports? Can we create more maybe club sports, like in college, there's a Division I team, and then there's the club team. Can we create a just for fun team, like a just for fun baseball team or a just for fun soccer team for sports? Is there any other solution for the average athlete to stay in the game and keep them interested?
Well, at Montclair State, the club program is really thriving. Dr. Gilbert and I both have kids who are in club hockey. They have club baseball, and they play other colleges. And in colleges, they get some allotment from the college, and then they put some of the money in themselves. I think that's a direction that schools are really moving in. The other thing I'd like to see is our physical education curriculums change to include more sports that you can play for your life. I think golf should be introduced early. I think tennis should be introduced to everybody. I think running should be introduced as well. These people who are doing marathons, they've been running all their life, or most of them were on track teams when they're in high school. If you don't play college football, you're done as soon as high school is over. I mean, you can't find 22 guys to get together and get equipment. Basketball becomes one-on-one. Baseball, you can't find 18 guys to play against each other. So I think we need to move more toward sports that people can play for their lifetime. And I really wouldn't worry about it so much. I think people will find their space. When I first started at Montclair State, thanks to Dr. Gilbert, he brought me up there. I never had kids in a class who played club. Now they ask me to come all of the time. Can you come and watch our club team? And they have it in almost every sport. So I think that's the way it's going to go. And I think that's great for a kid that doesn't want to go to practice every day, maybe wasn't an elite athlete, play a club sport. I doubt they can do that in high school because you don't have enough to draw from.
And then on the note of, sports you can play for life, can we also consider, hobbies you can play for life along with sports? Maybe if we pursue getting kids to play, perform cycling, perform in squash, in tennis, all those things, as well as maybe, marching band and things that are still active, but they're maybe aren't exactly sports themselves, or like just performing in a band. How can we get kids to be more active outside of the extracurriculars?
That's a good question. The first thing is, do they want to? If they don't want to, they're not going to do it. And a lot of kids have found side interests. Unfortunately, work is a big problem. There's a lot of kids who don't play sports because they have to work. I mean, if I had a magic wand, I would make it so no kid in high school or college worked, because you lose out on the experience of going to college or playing a sport in high school or college. But that's not the reality of it. The reality is they have to work. So I think some of the things you're suggesting are really good. I don't know if schools have the finances or the ability to have somebody get them involved in squash or something like that. But I know that there are advanced things for kids who are marching band, and your school has one of the top marching bands in the state. I think a lot of those kids, when they go to college, they'll participate. At Montclair State, we don't have a marching band. A lot of the Division III schools do not. But some of the big time schools, they offer scholarships for band kids. So I think that will continue. And it all comes down to, I quote Yogi Berra when it comes to this. What does the kid want to do? If the kid doesn't want to do a particular sport or a particular activity, they're not going to put the time in. If they don't put the time in, they won't be really competent or good. And if they're not good, they don't like it. So we have to let kids make their own choices. And, you have so many more choices. We didn't have kids that we went to school with who were doing their own screenplays, who were creating their own music videos, who were creating their own designer clothes. See, a lot of those kids, that's where their interests take them. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, we're never going to lose sports. I agree with Dr. Gilbert. We're never going to lose them. But some of the sports are going to suffer participation because there's just so many other choices.
And what Professor McCarthy is talking about is, look what you're doing right now. This is called Right on Sports. It's not called Right on Politics. It's not called Right on Writing. It's called Right on Sports. And it would be impossible for you to do this when we were growing up. I mean, are you kidding? There was not even a thought of something. So, you're into a really niche thing, really, and that's really, really great.
Well, then, Rob, let me ask you. John brought up what he would do with the magic wand. What would you do with a magic wand of sports?
What I would do with the magic wand in sports is make coaches better. Because that's the whole thing. There's a quote. It says, "A team of lions led by a lamb will always lose to a team of lambs led by a lion." So, and I'm not talking about just winning, but I mean, passionate people in sports. And I see it over and over again. The passionate people are the ones that change the lives. The kids want to be around them. Like Professor McCarthy and I share an office. There is not a day that goes by, and he hasn't coached basketball in probably 20 or 25 years. There isn't a day that goes by that one of his former athletes doesn't call him up every single day. And that's what a great coach does. That was it a couple of years ago, Professor McCarthy, the coach Hill died, Fred Hill.
Yes.
And he coached at Montclair State. I mean, they didn't have a funeral home. They rented out this huge church. There were, I had to walk 2 miles from parking my car just to go to his wake. And so that's what a great coach is. So if I had a magic wand, I'd make, and I'm not talking about the Vince Lombardi coach. I'm talking about the coach like John Wooden, that is the wise old man that just people want to be around and learn from. So once you make coaches better, they say the rising tide, raises all boats. Or the incoming tide raises all boats. And when you have great coaches, everything changes.
I think there's a lot we can learn from just kind of the rise of hobbies, the rise of, pseudo sports like esports, like John brought, which he'll say isn't it a sport. But, and at the end of the day, some sports are going to thrive, some sports are going to die out. We saw that, 50 years ago, some sports survived, some sports died out. We're going to see that today. We're going to see it 50 years from now. But at the end of the day, we're going to see, I do believe that sports are going to stay just as relevant as ever. I just think that we need to start kids early and we have to keep them early because I don't think we're going to lose as many high school athletes that way just because of the eliteness and the competitiveness. I think the problem lies more with younger kids and older kids. But, that's all I have for today. I'm going to give it back to Mr. Jacobson. Thank you so much, guys.